Thank you, Jordan, and thank you everyone for inviting James and I to say a few words at the start of this symposium. And welcome audience to this year's Student Symposium and other online offerings. So we've been asked to say a few words, first of all, about what design history actually is. What is history of design? So in history of design, we think about history and we do history through the study of everyday and extraordinary material culture in the widest possible sense. And our focus can go way beyond the museum object to include food, plants and animals, the human body, the built environment, design systems, and the digital, and even pushes discussions of materiality to include sound and movement. But to bring it back to real design history basics, I could ask any of you sitting at home, what actually are you sitting on right now? How is that chair, if it is a chair, a materialization of your own history and the history of others? We could think about the things that are in your room, perhaps, or the curtains, or the carpet, the type and design of the windows, the building itself that you're in, the road, the cars outside, the layout and material substance of your neighborhood, the typeface on the street signs. Are there trees outside? And what are the materials and the processes that we use to make all of these things? Who were the people that made that happen? And what were the interactions that moved all of these things from one owner or one place to another? Or what caused new styles or new technologies to come into being, or that made certain aspects of the material world and the natural world important? And how is the past being dealt with in the present through preservation or renewal? And how are we planning for the future at an individual or national level through the material culture that surrounds us? And this is all the stuff of design history. Design history can tell us about how design solves problems and how social problems shape our material world. It can tell us how history as a material legacy figures in our everyday lives, and how in our everyday lives we interact with the immaterial using our sensing bodies and the technologies that surround us. COVID-19, together with the urgency of climate change and social justice campaigns, means that we are living through times that have changed forever our perceptions of what it means to be globally interconnected, and even what it means to simply be at home. And it's prompted a new focus on what a caring society looks like, and new ways of working and relating, not to mention studying for an MA. The students who are graduating from our programme this year, whose work we celebrate this evening, tomorrow and Friday, have had to weather many storms and navigate many altered terrains in the course of their studies. Their work, which they're about to share with us, not only shows us what is still possible during a global pandemic, but also how design history as a discipline may go forward in these new times. Over to James.
Thank you, Sarah, for giving us, I think, very warm, articulate, and I think a very hopeful vision of what it means to practice the history of design. As Jordan said in her introduction, my name is James Ryan, and with Sarah, I am co-head of this programme for the history of design, and I'm based in the V&A Museum. And one of the best bits of my job is once a year to be able to welcome friends, family, colleagues into the magnificent Lydia and Manfred Gorby Lecture Theatre at the V&A in South Kensington, and to celebrate there the work of the students, the graduating students. And that's something we do, as Jordan said, usually in person every year. I'm not able to do that this year, as you know. The best thing I could do to evoke a sense of that place is to have this this Zoom backdrop. So I'm afraid that's as close as you're going to get to the lecture theatre, but it's a beautiful place to be. So sadly, we're not able to be there in person to soak up the atmosphere of that amazing space, or to mingle afterwards in the silver galleries over a drink. But I hope you'll have time in your own places to celebrate the achievements of the students who are going to showcase their work this evening and in the next events to follow. There are some compensations. Much as I miss being in the museum, there are some compensations from operating in an online space. One of those is that there's no limit to the number of people who we can welcome to events like this, which is fantastic. People can join from all around the world in their own time zones. They can come and go without disturbing everyone else. And we don't have any clearing up to do afterwards either, which is a real boon. But the other positive thing I think about this format is that it has, despite a lot of the very difficult challenges, it's really made students, and I think you'll see this in what follows, have to work together in new ways to come up with really innovative formats to represent and share their ideas and research. And I think they've been truly inspiring in how they've done that. So I would like, on behalf of my colleagues in the History of Design and at the V&A, to congratulate the whole team behind this wonderful graduation website, which, as Jordan said, this is the virtual architecture that houses the symposium live events. This is the first one today, but it will also in due course include their publication and show. And I know how hard everyone has worked behind the scenes to put together what is really a totally new way to bring together and share your MA research. In this sense, you have really been trailblazers. This is the first time this has been done. You're using digital resources and spaces in the history of design. And I think you've set down some very important markers for future generations of students to really think through how can we explore these new ways of sharing design knowledge, design history knowledge that you have produced. And you've done all this, it has to be said, while not being able to meet in person or in our usual spaces at the V&A or the RCA. So that in itself is a real challenge. I've got two final points, things that have made your website and design and the themes that you've chosen around the material and these virtual worlds. There are two themes I think that for me sort of made me think about in particular. One of them is really to do with memory. Like you, I'm sure, I've really missed being in the V&A, and I find myself remembering spaces in it and sort of walking down corridors and trying to remember which rooms. It's a good thing to do if you can't sleep, I think, to try and navigate your way around the museum and get lost. But I do really miss that sense of being in the space, of hearing the noise of the galleries, of catching snippets of conversation, of seeing the curators and guides and visitors and the objects, of course, having that sense of the museum as and the spaces and the collections of being a kind of living, breathing entity. But I think what's particularly brilliant and elegantly simple about your website design is that it takes that floor print of the museum the plan, the spatial design, a design that we're very familiar with in our everyday navigation around that museum. But it uses that then as a framework onto which to place your individual and collective research inquiries. So I think that's a really, really nice thing. And I particularly like that. I think it was Cicero, the classical thinker, who supposedly advised classical rhetoricians who wanted to learn the art of memory, that a good way of doing that was to disperse parts of a narrative or a story through a real or imagined building. And so the building becomes a repository of memory. And that's the way to remember your story, by walking your way around that building. So again, I think it's a really nice way of thinking about museum spaces and other buildings as repositories of memory. And I think that connects through to thinking through this connection between the real and the virtual. So the second point I wanted to make was about materiality. And I think one of the things that your website does really nicely, and also it comes through in all of your research projects, your dissertations, is this connection, and Sarah mentioned this connection between the material and the virtual or imagined world. And that imagined and designed worlds also come to shape our material worlds, and the imagined and designed virtual worlds that we're working in, the worlds of Google, the other virtual worlds that are increasingly shaping our material lives, are themselves designed. They have histories, they have complex social structures, they have a politics. And I think one of the great things that a lot of your work this year that we've seen is your concern with investigating those worlds and thinking about them as designed, as having histories, and as deserving of critical scrutiny and critical attention. So in conclusion, let me just say welcome everyone. It's fantastic that you're here in the virtual V&A. I hope you can come back to the real V&A soon. Thank you very much, students, 2019, 2020 cohort team, for your fantastic hard work, for your resilience, your positive spirit, and for designing such a brilliant website onto which you are placing your symposium events. I'm looking forward enormously to seeing what happens. And congratulations, everyone, not just for your for this website, but also for your individual and very rich research projects, which I'm looking forward to hearing more about. Thank you.
Thank you, James, and thank you, Jordan and Sarah, as well, for your lovely introductions. My name is Denise. I'll be the chair for today's panel, which will begin now. So I think I speak for most of my colleagues when I say that the overarching question of our panel today, that being what is design history, is something we've all struggled to grapple with, even as we've come to the end of our graduate degrees. And indeed, if one were to review the literature of design history anthologies that have been published in the past 10 years, there's a general sense that it's quite hard to catch up with a discipline which is very quickly and constantly evolving and expanding in scope. In the words of Grace Lee's Mathé in 2016, which I've just noticed is in the conversation right now, so I'm really sorry if I butcher it, but design history's prescient and integral interdisciplinarity has been regarded as a given by design historians, so that attempts to capture these connections have been few and piecemeal. And so I bring up this quote not to kind of add fuel to the fire, but to suggest a way in which today, when faced with this kind of unlocatedness, how conversations such as the one we're about to have will hopefully offer a situated survey of the topics, theoretical frameworks, and methodologies used by design historians and students from 2019 to 2021 in particular. And hopefully in doing so, for listeners who might be coming in from other areas and other disciplines, we can find shared vocabularies to encourage the kind of collaboration and dialogue that design history also thrives off. So having said so, it's my pleasure to introduce to you our three panelists for today, whose work represents a microcosm of the diverse geographies, ideas, and practices that form the discipline. So firstly, we have Anna Talley, whose work on the MA focuses on communication design in the 20th and 21st centuries. And her dissertation explored how Google uses design as a tool to augment the company's neocolonial actions. And more broadly, her interests include design history, the digital humanities, and design curation. Fleur Alkerton will also be joining us today. Fleur's postgraduate research broadly focuses on replication, reproduction, and knowledge exchange of medieval design in both modern and medieval contexts. Her dissertation examines medieval automata as highly technical objects, whilst exploring collaborative design practice in a world where the concept of design didn't yet exist. And finally, we have Deepika Srivastava, whose work on the MA focuses on how contemporary architectural practice in India can be studied through the lens of its day-to-day operations and the aspect of collaboration inherent in design production. She's a storyteller at heart, and for her, design history is a lens to understand the world one design at a time. So we will begin with a roundtable discussion, which should last around half an hour, and then we'll open up the discussion for a 15-minute Q&A prompted by questions from you. So just as a reminder, please feel free to type away at the chat box as the discussion goes along. We'll be monitoring that and we'll try to respond to as many of these as possible. So now I'd like to invite our three panelists to turn on their mics to begin our roundtable discussion. Hi guys.
Hello.
Hi. Just so to begin, could I please ask the three of you what you did before the MA and what got you into the field as a kind of introduction?
I can go first. So before I started the MA, I studied art and design history at the Pratt Institute in New York. And I got into design history because I was interested in design. And I had wanted to be a graphic designer. And then I realized that graphic design as a discipline fits within a much larger constellation of design, whether that is, you know, some sort of super graphics on the side of a building or digital technologies. And through that, I became interested in just studying design in a broader context, which is what brought me to the RCA V&A program. So I've been able to sort of build on the survey education that I had in design history as an undergrad in this program and really expand what I thought and how to look at and the different types of methodologies and frameworks that you can look at design and design history, which is what has informed a lot of the work I've done on the program.
I can go next, that helps. So I come from quite a varied background. I've been part of National Youth Theatre since I was about 15, and I worked with them kind of making costumes and designing costumes for the stage. And straight after finishing school, I went on and did a year in a practical art and design foundation course. But after that, I realized what I really was interested in was the kind of historical aspects of design, of these design decisions and the research behind that. And I went on and did quite a traditional undergraduate degree in history and really explored and challenged myself in that, but ended up coming back at the end of my degree to kind of material culture and architecture, specializing in medieval Europe and its relationships with the Islamicate world through material culture and architecture. And actually a personal tutor on my course at undergrad suggested this MA to me because she knew that I was always juggling my history course with kind of creating and designing for theatre. So she said, have you heard of this? And it just really fitted the way that I saw how I wrote and researched history, which is the same as my creative practices. I see them as the same kind of language. So yeah, it's just the perfect kind of synergy between my design and kind of practical practices and my historical interests. So that's what led me into the field.
Hi everyone. I have done my bachelor's in interior design from STEP University in India. And it's a university which has courses in architecture, planning, and civil engineering as well. And now even product and industrial design. So that studying in that school gave me an overall exposure of what design and architecture is. And I think in my second year, I read somewhere that, you know, just 3% of the world's buildings are actually designed by qualified architects. And I started thinking about why is there this gap and how can we bridge the gap between the designer and the public. And as part of, and then I kept thinking, and in my final year dissertation, I wrote it on change in the representation of the kitchen in contemporary India and how representation in lifestyle media. So I actually profiled the advertisements and I read, I tried to see how the projects are written about, how the kitchen is written about, and what kind of a picture does it create. And when I was doing that research, all my secondary readings, a lot of them, they came from the graduates of this course. And I got to know about the producer consumer mediator paradigm, which really excited me because looking at design as a social process, looking at design, which like looking at all three aspects together is what had been a part of my thinking, and I applied here and I got in. So that's my story.
Thank you so much. I think we have like a really unique panel where all of you have come from a practice-based discipline at some point. I was wondering, how has this affected, well, more broadly, how has this affected your practice as a design historian? And you know, what was the kind of output that has come out of your work in the past year? In terms of like writing, drawing.
Right. So, I mean, I would say that coming from a practical background or having that knowledge of making has really helped me personally, kind of linking to what James was saying about the kind of the tangible and the material whilst we're living in these kind of virtual environments, I think, because especially when you're trying to research and uncover stories of making and designing and craft in the past, and you're trying to kind of create that tangible connection, if you have a knowledge of the kind of practical skills or the practical process of what went into that, even if you can't view the object or touch the object in person, like we can't currently in pandemic times. It's really helped me, I would say, having that kind of background in practical making. I'm not sure what the others think.
I don't know. I would say that my background in practical making is more about a way to think apart from the practice of design history. Not that it is not involved with it in some way, but I think that it I tend to use like the skills that I have, particularly in drawing, as a way to kind of meditate on things that I've already done in my research. So I think of it more as something that informs the work indirectly by giving me a space to go to that isn't necessarily some sort of, you know, library space or an academic environment necessarily. And using that sort of break as a way to reformulate my thoughts, to be able to come back to that research and writing with a little bit of a more clear mind.
I think for me, I see a design historian working at the intersection of the designer and the wider audience. And having that practical education, I think it gives me a lens into the mind of a designer. So when I see myself working at the intersection of the two, I know that I have the skills to, you know, really get, maybe because I don't have the practical experience in on field, but I still know how they think. I can understand and I can ask the right questions and help communicate those narratives to the public. I think that, like, it allows me to be a good bridge between the two. I think that's where my practical education really helps me. And my dissertation has focused on contemporary architectural practice in India and how we can look at design as a social process through the lens of collaboration. So I think here it all really came through together.
Thank you. So, I mean, Deepika, you brought up, you know, words like bridging, intersection, collaboration. I was wondering if you could respond to about how you would define the boundaries of the discipline then, and perhaps like how useful it actually is to define the term design history.
Yeah, I think, boundaries, like I said, I think it's a very design history as a very interdisciplinary field. And as we mentioned earlier, you know, that it is constantly evolving. I think the boundary of, I look at design history as an approach and as a way of looking at things. And I think as the world is changing at a very fast rate, I think the boundary really depends on, like, this has, I think it is really rooted in what's happening today. And yeah, I think it also, I'm sorry, you asked about design history, if having a term design history is useful as well, right? That was also a part of the question. Yeah, so design, I think in defining design history, the problem comes in the use of the word history because it is related to the past, whereas design is constantly evolving and it's very dynamic. So design history, if you put it together, it's actually the coming together of a word which is constantly evolving and one which is very static. So that itself makes it very interesting. And defining anything, I think it's a very self-reflective practice. So I'm not sure how exactly we can define it, but I think we should, using words like interdisciplinary and self-reflective will put us in a good place to constantly adapt to the changing environment.
Anna and Fleur, do you have any response?
Sure. I definitely agree with Deepika, this idea of it has to be a kind of very interdisciplinary, self-reflexive sort of ongoing process. Design history as a kind of way of thinking. In terms of kind of boundaries, it's really interesting, especially as somebody who works in the late Middle Ages, because I find myself coming up against really what I would call a chronological boundary almost, where pretty much any text or kind of, you know, sort of foundational book that I found on design history specifically will start in the European Renaissance. And, you know, for me, a lot of what I do in my research and my work is really trying to sort of widen out that chronology and question why it seems to start at this kind of, you know, straight kind of date of, you know, the 16th century. This is kind of, you know, when when design history sort of kicks off with the European Renaissance. And I think it was mentioned before, I think by Deepika, this idea of the producer, consumer, mediator model, which is a model that we're all kind of taught and told about as a useful way of thinking about design history. And quite a lot of my work is again questioning that, because surely we can have a design history of an era or of a society that doesn't necessarily have you know, consumers or consumer culture as we recognize it today. Or so that's, yeah, quite a lot of my research. I'm really questioning those boundaries and playing with them and trying to expand them and adapt them. And drawing on the idea of maybe, yeah, again, Deepika, when you mentioned about history and kind of thinking about it being in the past, I think quite often the word history can be seen as a reference to something very sort of linear and very kind of one way and chronological. And again, that seems to jar. It's kind of it's a jarring term, I feel, design history. You know, we're talking about this evolving practice that's always constantly in motion against, yeah, this sort of static, linear, chronological, or that's how people think of history as a discipline. And I don't agree with that necessarily. So yeah, again, it's kind of interesting to play around with the terms. And I think we need to be, especially in my work, I have to be really careful to not retrospectively label anything, because that is very bad historical practice. I'm trying to look for something that we can recognize as design practice today, a kind of collaborative practice, sort of sharing of technical knowledge. But I'm working in an era that doesn't necessarily use the word design or doesn't use a word like design in reference to what we see design today. So it's a very complex thing, and it's a very complex relationship. But I think just in terms of my work, I think questioning those boundaries is hopefully, you know, bringing about some important, you know, showing some important questions that hopefully will add to the field and add to that ongoing process that we're talking about.
Thanks, Claire. I guess that, I mean, it's really interesting to hear how you guys perceive design history as a discipline as students who study the work. But I guess to flip the question kind of is, maybe the question is, how do you think design history is perceived by, you know, people outside the discipline? So like, what are some reactions maybe that you perceived when you tell people that you study design history? Anna, do you have a response?
Sure. I mean, I think you usually have to do quite a bit of explaining. And I think like part of that explaining has to go back to this sort of like an inability to define really like what it is and give like a really strong dictionary definition. I think that there's a big difference between being able to explain to people like the difference of defining design history as a discipline and what that discipline actually is. So, you know, you can tell people about, you know, the journal or publishing, or, you know, it's defined by the fact that it's usually associated with art institutions or something like that. And so that gives people, I think, sort of a basis to understand like where it's coming from. But then what gets tricky is like when you talk about the content of like what design history is as a practice. And then I think that's really individual. So, you know, when I tell people like, oh, I study communication design, what does that really mean, and having to define that. And then once you get down to like that actual content, I think it's like when people start to understand kind of what that means more, when you start to talk to them sort of at an individual level about what it is that you do within the field. But I think, yeah, I think like being able to like explain what design history is at parties really comes down to this question of how do you even define design history within a panel of design historians, which is, you know, quite difficult. And I don't think any of us would ever be able to come to some sort of, you know, solid conclusion about what that is.
I think the reaction I get is art history. And if I say design history and I come from I have a professional design degree, they expect me to know all the details of, you know, all the styles of all the movements and all the styles that happened. So recently I had gone to a 13th century temple in my city only, and my friends, they are MBAs and engineers, and they just expected me to know that. I'll tell them what's the iconography like and what is this particular style, what does it stand for. I think that's the kind of reaction I get. And I haven't like, I normally don't do a lot of explaining. I'm like, okay, understand, I think they do understand once I tell them that I'm trying to be between the public and the designer. I think that's what something they understand. But yeah, it's like a lot of explaining.
Yeah, definitely to similar experiences. I think you say you do design history or a design historian, and you're normally met with a bit of a look of confusion, which is interesting. You know, when you say I'm an art historian, for example, everyone seems to kind of have that idea of what that is and what that practice is. And I do tend to, you know, when met with that look of confusion, I tend to sort of panic and just go, objects, I study objects. Or like architecture, I study architecture. And that, again, people seem to kind of be able to compute that if you kind of say the things that you're studying, yeah, rather than the practice itself. Definitely. I mean, and I think once you actually explain it, if you do say things like, you know, oh, I study, you know, who designed objects and who made objects and who, you know, designed architecture, made architecture or whatever, then they seem to think it's really cool. But I don't know if the others have had that experience, but once you actually kind of, yeah, actually describe it in a way that people sort of understand, maybe from the point of view of the things we study, not the practice itself, people seem to be like, oh, that's actually really cool, you know. But yeah, then similarly to Piki, you kind of get, you know, who made this walk and how, and, you know, all of those questions too. So you again seem to be expected to know everything, but I feel like that might just be part and parcel of being a historian in general. People think that you know everything about anything. But yeah.
I would just like to add one thing that, you know, going back to your previous question about definition of design history, I think it needs to be redefined in a way which includes words like, you know, thinking, innovation, because nowadays we have design thinking, we have design innovation. I think design history, the way we work, it bridges the two. So a term which can encompass history, thinking, and innovation, or a similar word can be a productive way to, I think, redefine or define design history.
And I think too, to build on that, also kind of like what Fleur and Deepika were both saying about when you're talking to people who may not be so familiar with the field, is that you typically go to like a name or, you know, a person who's designed something, which is interesting because I think that sort of the celebrity designer used to be one of the defining boundaries of the discipline. And now that is not true anymore. I don't think. I think it still is in sort of popular media. That might be the way that people look at design and design history. But we know as practicing design historians that it's no longer defined by that boundary. So just noting that sort of, I don't know, lag in it, you know, having these, I guess it's like a cultural landmark. But also, you know, if we're thinking about design history and how is design history practiced in public places, which I know is not the topic of this panel, but how do we expand that definition for the public so that it's no longer just, you know, these designer celebrities that people can point to and name, you know, a Philippe Starck chair or something like that.
Yeah, so having moved away from this kind of celebrity designer, where do you guys see design history going in the future? What are some trends that you've enjoyed seeing? Perhaps Fleur, you can start us off.
Sure. So I've always had this thing where I think that historians of the future will sort of be data scientists. I think, you know, if we think 100 or 200 years in the future, there'll be such an overwhelming amount of data, of sources of data out there, that almost historians will become pattern finders. And I think as design historians, we're very well placed to deal with that because, for example, sort of data visualization or GIS, sort of geographic imaging software, where there's kind of these visual representations of historical data and how to sort of interpret those and represent those and, you know, draw arguments and conclusions out of them. I think as design historians, we're sort of trained in this kind of framework of seeing the world and this kind of intersection, as Deepika said, between kind of design things, visual sources, material culture, and historical data and hard traditional historical research. I think it's quite exciting, and I think we'd be very good at that kind of, and a lot of us already are. Those like Anna who are working on sort of digital design and data are already working with those sources. So yeah, and it's a bit dependent on, whether all that data is going to be accurate and, whether that's going to completely change the course of kind of how historians work. But yeah, and the whole kind of digital preservation issues, for example, I learned last week about something fascinating called bit rot, which is apparently just like getting molds on, an actual physical object, but on, digital images, and we don't quite know how it happens. It's just, there's kind of corruption of the bits of images can happen. So this idea of like how historians will work with all this digital data in the future is really interesting. And yeah, I think design historians are really perfectly placed to work with that kind of visual data. But I think that's quite a dystopian vision, so I'd be interested what the others think.
For me, I think I see in the future of design history. I think I see more design historians working in policy making and innovation sectors, because even as Sarah earlier mentioned, in her opening note, that we are trying to understand the social problems and help solve them too. So I think that kind of I see that also, and helping to capitalize design as a tool to empower the world and to empower communities. And I think coming to Fleur's question of, how what she mentioned about data visualizations, and like I don't think it's a dystopian vision. I think it's the reality, and I think the best way to cope with this reality is to make it utopian and not dystopian. So I think that's yeah, and also a personal goal I would say is to, as Anna also mentioned, that though design history has moved away from the master architect and the master designer perception, the media hasn't. So I hope to help, change that narrative uh, in the media, and have a focus on consumer as well, when in journalistic writing about architecture and design. I think because that's journalistic writing is a very important part. Media depictions are a very important part of how any profession is perceived, and I think as a design historian we are well placed to do that as well. So I think that's all from me.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that, building off of what both of you said, the idea of like a globalizing design history is something that's sort of been in the works for like the last, 15 years. And I think it's probably still continuing. And so design history will continue to move in a more global framework, and thinking about the sorts of networks and things like that. I think that global framework and the content of study, again, is defined more about what is that design in design history. So how does that design change over time? I always go back to one thing that Josie Kane said on one of the first days of class, was that design historians are really good historians. And the practice of being a really good historian has changed over time. But I think there are some like tenets to what it is to be a really good historian that don't change. And that has to do with, the sort of rigor of research that you practice as a historian. But then what's interesting about being a design historian is that the design part is constantly evolving, what it is that you decide to study and what it is that you decide to study within that continuum. So I think that, design historians of the future are, as we continue to innovate and create new designs, sort of like in response to the climate crisis, or in response to this more globalizing world, it's that content that I think will change kind of what defines design historians of the future.
Thanks so much.
And I'd just like to add one thing, that, we mentioned the word global quite a bit, and I too did. And I think coming from India, when I came to the UK, I actually realized that sometimes global means it's still more focused on the global north. Like when we say global, it needs to like have a more equitable equitable and more inclusive of both the global north and the global south. And even this global north and global south, I find a bit misplaced. And these kind of this also, I hope in the future it changes and the boundaries they expand and they intersperse.
Great, thanks so much, Deepa. I think it's actually time to open up the room for the Q&A. So I'm just going to start with Cheryl's comment, who just said, just an observation about Deepika's astute observation about design history or design thinking. This is also a current conversation in how to bridge fashion theory and fashion history, and has been encompassed in the term fashion thinking. I guess in the relation to design history, there's been kind of the same kind of trajectory of, different disciplines and different ways to define design thinking, design theory, or what do you think the differences are between these different terms?
I mean, I think design thinking is something that's like definitely co-opted by places like IDEO to sort of spread a very particular way of thinking coming out of Silicon Valley, particularly. So I'm not a huge proponent of the idea of design thinking. I think design thinking as a term, it has a really specific connotation to it. I would be open to seeing that change over time, and encompass kind of a broader way of thinking about what we mean when we say design thinking. But that's a pretty cynical way of looking at it, I guess.
And yeah, and the term is also adopted by MBA schools nowadays. I think they have like design thinking modules. So I think I agree with Anna that it's a somewhat, I think it needs to change, and yeah, it's maybe a bit cynical way to look at it.
Yeah, I also agree. It's being co-opted, and I feel like it's kind of a very wide and not particularly helpful label, really. But yeah, no, I agree with what has already been said on that.
We also have a question from Raphael. How are perceptions about the past, how can they be molded into the present and our practical projectual choices?
Oh, can you please repeat it? I think
Yeah, wow,
it.
can you?
How can perceptions about the past mold in the present our practical or projectual choices?
I don't know, and correct me if I've got this wrong, but I don't know if this is kind of referring a little bit to how I said about not kind of retrospectively labeling or kind of putting our present biases onto the past, for example. I don't know, correct me if I'm getting the wrong meaning there, but this idea of kind of, yes, ideas about our perceptions about what the past was can kind of mold what we're thinking about, how we're thinking about it in the present. And I think definitely with working with something like the Middle Ages, there is a lot there that people will assume, will assume that things weren't sophisticated, or will assume that people were, less, less educated, or thought about things less, or kind of, this kind of idea of kind of retrospective discrimination almost, and having to really be mindful of that. Even as somebody who studied this era and this kind of work for years now, I have to constantly be sort of checking my own biases and how I'm reading sources and drawing ideas out of them, so that I'm not kind of making those assumptions of, oh well, this person probably didn't think about things in this way because they didn't know about this kind of area or couldn't read, or just because somebody doesn't read doesn't mean that they can't think about technology, for example. I hope that kind of answers it. I felt like that was a very, very broad question, but that's what I kind of got out of that question.
Yeah, I was just thinking that like I think it's a broad question, and so a broad answer is that I think it gives you more informed ways to act in the future, or to think about how your acts can affect the future. That would be my best answer to that. And I think like what those actions are is really dependent on why you're looking to history, and for what reason, and how do you expect your personal foray into the past to then affect whatever it is that you're working on in the present. Broad answer.
I think the question of identity is also quite important here, because our current identity is shaped by our past events, and I think that question is like quite important as well, and that's why it is important to refer to the past.
Thank you. We also have a question from Felicity. She asks, what do you think design historians specifically can bring to the current conversation about decolonialization of collections and curricula?
I think, okay, so I think we need to, what design historians can bring to how we look at collections and curricula. I'll start at a basic thing, we need to relook at how we do research, which I think we are already doing, because our primary sources, we find them in very unconventional ways, because we go through archives, and even when we go to archives, we look for the little things, and we for the little known things, and we also like oral history. So I think re-looking at how we do research, because research forms the basis of everything. I think design historians are quite well placed to do that, because the way we are taught to do primary research. I think that's where I see design historians contributing.
I agree
Yeah,
with Deepika. Oh, sorry.
oh, I was just gonna say,
you go for it.
Sorry. I was just gonna say, building off that, how and what we research, I think, is also really important. I think like no object is too big or too small to be investigated with these sort of critical lenses. Speaking from personal experience of having spent 4 months looking at a Bovril ad, you could pull out a lot of English colonial history from a very small Bovril ad that's like that big. So, I think really broadening what the kinds of things that we choose to research and the lenses through which we choose to research those objects is, part and parcel of how we research those things as well.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with those 2 points. And I think I was just going to add maybe a broader point that as design historians, I think we're really aware of the power of objects and the emotional dimension of them, the kind of emotive power and authority they can have. And I think that gives us, we're well suited then into sometimes, being able to deal with these kind of complex issues and conversations that are being had around collections and decolonialization. And I feel sometimes if you're not a historian of material culture or design or objects, you can just get lost in the textual side of sources, and you're not always focusing on those objects, and maybe being able to have that empathy and that awareness around the power and the emotion that objects can have to individuals and to societies and to cultures.
Yeah, we've just had a very relevant comment from Dinod saying, design as a discipline is ever expanding, evolving, and design history is mapping this evolution through different lenses like social, cultural, global, local, and political. So I guess the question is, perhaps something we haven't talked about is, how do you guys choose your lenses? Like what's the kind of process through which you decide your methodologies and your practices as well?
I think in my case, I think my personal experience and my observation and in my own self-reflective nature informs what I research. And methodology, it's more to do, I've always focused more on, like in my dissertation, I focused on interviews and oral history. So I think that, and that informs my methodology. Yeah.
I think a lot of my methodology is almost, I like to think of it as negative space. So quite often I'll kind of, I'll have this, I'll be building on kind of the gaps, if that makes sense, or where especially in my field, because there isn't necessarily like medieval design history particularly, there'll be social historians from the 50s or the 60s who I think are definitely writing about design history, but they're not putting it in those terms. So I'm kind of constantly reading all of these fields that feed into it, and then kind of building a picture of what actually I'm trying to really research in terms of my secondary literature and kind of my methodology from what everybody has said and the gaps that they're all missing, if that makes sense. So I like to think, I suppose going back to that comment about drawing and drawing practices, I kind of think about it in that way of kind of constructing almost from the negative. So yeah, I hope that answered that question.
Yeah, I guess very briefly, I kind of like to let the object or whatever it is that I'm studying inform the methods that I then use to study that object. So I would say that, one thing that's been really great about this MA course has been being introduced to all types of different methodologies. and the sort of, you know, decolonial methodology specifically, as opposed to like more traditional ways of looking at objects. And I think like having that really broad base to choose from, and then to say, okay, this is the thing that I'm studying, which methodologies best fit this thing, and how can I broaden those methodologies to sort of satisfy all the different frameworks that I want to view this object in, is the way that I would go about it. So I don't think that for me, there's like a very particular, you know, process that I would go through every time, except for the fact that I happen to study things that are quite similar. So the methodologies kind of tend to come up more than once. But I think that would, you know, that could change depending on whatever the thing is. So sort of, I don't know, function follows form in the opposite way.
Yeah, I think it's a creative practice, so it grows as we figure out more things.
Awesome, thank you so much. I think we only have 2 minutes left for questions, but we have a really good one to end the conversation. Mimi asks, can there be design history without objects?
Oh yeah, I think I mean, you know, histories of like the body, I think immaterial, like the idea of the immaterial systems, I think is something that like systems design, or the design of systems that might not actually be like physical infrastructure. You know, all of these things, definitely you can have design history without physical objects.
And also to read that question in a slightly different way, thinking about doing a design history without access to objects or material survival, I would say yes, because I've almost anything I've really pretty much researched from the Middle Ages does not have material survival, and I've been able to do it. It doesn't make it easy in that kind of negative space aspect of trying to kind of construct these ideas around what these objects were and how they were made. Sometimes kind of having to compare it to similar kind of crafts, for example, makes it difficult, but you can kind of find the objects even if the objects aren't there or haven't survived, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah, I think design history definitely can happen without materials, and because you can even, you know, document people's experiences, that itself can become a design history. So definitely can happen without.
I think that's a brilliant way to end our conversation today. I'd just like to thank our panelists so much for a really insightful conversation, and also to our audience for their really insightful questions. I think I've got some keywords that I picked up from the conversation today: pattern finders, intersections, evolving, continuum, immaterial systems. I think these are some things that definitely will leave us a lot to think about, and for the next few days. And I mean, in 15 minutes, we have another conversation, which will be called, it'll be themed around missing perspectives. So I can't think of a better way to segue into our next symposium. So we'll have a brief 15-minute break before that, and the link to that symposium will be left in the chat box on the right again. I'd like to thank you guys so much again for having us, and have a really good day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.